5.
When newspapers are trying to express disapproval, out comes the word revellers.
4.
Stand away, you're cancelled.
3.
I think if we don't hang our heads in shame, we've lost it as a society.
2.
No, we're not lucky to be given crumbs off the banqueting table of freedom.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello?
And me, Liam Halligan. The number of COVID-19 patients in UK hospitals has plummeted since mid-January. Deaths from or with COVID are 95% down from their peak. The 7-day rolling average of fatalities is back where it was last June, just as pubs and restaurants were about to fully reopen. Yet we're still weeks and weeks from such freedoms, even though, unlike last summer of course, well over half of all UK adults are vaccinated, with close to 99% of those in the most vulnerable groups having been offered the jab. There's a lot of news around co-pilot Pearson, the alarming treatment of a religious studies teacher in Batley, whereas you wrote in your column this week, so far the only grown-up people in this situation are the kids. There's a new official report concluding the UK should be regarded as a model for other white majority countries when it comes to race relations. But we'll start with COVID, because as the weather improves and cases and fatalities remain low, the government's under increasing pressure to alter its roadmap, giving us a faster, more direct route out of lockdown.
Well, yes, co-pilot, we had Happy Monday this week, didn't we? There were golfers out at midnight with glow-in-the-dark balls. That's how I tend to regard my co-pilot's speech, glow-in-the-dark balls. Yeah, people were thrilled, weren't they? And they were all allowed to get back to activities outside, which, as we know, Liam, should never have been banned in the first place. I mean, Scotland's kept its golf courses open. The idea that tennis was ever banned, the most socially distant sport you can possibly imagine. Anyway, I had mixed feelings. I was thrilled to see people going to parks and beaches. Something that always makes me laugh, Liam, is that that when newspapers are trying to express disapproval, out comes the word revellers. Have you seen that? Revellers on Brighton Beach. Never people having a picnic, it's always revellers, and it's a word that's never used in any other context.
That revelling family sitting there eating actual ham and cheese sandwiches, drinking tea from a flask.
Yeah, so anyway, the great British public getting back in touch with its freedom and you know, on a more serious point, first of all, I don't think we should be feeling gratitude. The way it's presented on the TV news, aren't we lucky? You know, no, we're not lucky to be given crumbs off the banqueting table of freedom. It's our freedom. It's not for them to measure it out in little kind of teaspoons that they could give it back to us. But on a bigger point, Liam, I think this was actually, look, we don't crow, do we? We don't crow. Well, you do a bit, but you know, we do. On Planet Normal.
I glowed. I don't crow, according to you.
You glow in the dark balls. Let's not go there. Well, anyway, you've made me lots of words there. But I think it was, with all due modesty, I think it was a tremendous week of vindication for Planet Normal, because many of the things we've been banging on about for almost a year now came to fruition. So the government said hands, face, space, fresh air. The admission that shutting people down for 1 year inside when you're safe outside. So, you know, that was extraordinary. We saw the Telegraph reporting that 7 in 10 positive COVID cases in school children are likely to be wrong. Tens of thousands of kids and families are having to isolate needlessly. Now, hasn't co-pilot been boring you with the need to bring back confirmatory PCR tests? We've been saying this, that the infections are now so low across the country that these tests that kids are having to do twice a week in school are just totally unreliable. Most of them are wrong. And this is a more subtle point, Liam. If you recall back in January, Boris warned us that the new Kent variant of the coronavirus is not only more infectious, but maybe 30% more deadly. Now, you'll remember, Liam, how that really, put the willies up people. But this week, very quietly, that claim was totally discredited.
Wow.
There's no truth in that at all. But of course, the damage was done. That claim that the Kent variant was 30% more deadly in January made headlines, hiding the good news that R had fallen in most regions to below 1.
Oh, that's the rate of reinfection. And when it's below 1, it means the disease in general terms is constricting. When it's above 1, it means the disease is spreading.
That's exactly right. But so those were splash headlines, 30% more deadly, third more people are going to die. No, totally untrue. But of course, we're not going to have the BBC News tonight is not going to say, forget everything we told you about the Kent variant being deadly. It's actually just the same as all the others. But I think, we keep talking about a sea change. This week, we didn't just see the British people rediscovering, getting a taste for freedom, having a lovely time, but we've also seen the media subtly adjusting now, coming over to the planet normal dark side, because we had the Daily Mail with a huge coverage of why lockdown is a total disaster. Economic cost of lockdown is £521 million a day. Furlough alone is costing us £139 million every day, Liam. So I'm seeing more coverage now of not just the financial cost, but the psychological cost, the mental health costs, all music to Planet Normal's ears. We've been derided and attacked, haven't we? But I think this was vindication week.
It was Happy Monday earlier this week. The sun was shining. The small town where I live in North Essex, there was a real sort of palpable release of emotion.
Yeah.
As people not came out on the streets and revelled with their flasks of tea, but just being able to see the neighbours properly and have a beer in the back garden and reconnect. And I think if the metrics continue to improve as much as they are, the government is going to have to, I think, yield to some degree on its roadmap, lest it be seen as not just heartless, but irrational even.
Well, I'm not sure that they will yield, because they seem to be so wedded to this roadmap. And as you say, it becomes increasingly illogical and farcical. And my nomination for numpty of the week in a hotly contested field, it has to be said.
And I'm always a contender, right? I'm always up there. I'm always pushing for the podium.
Yeah, narrowly snatched from you. Sports Minister Nigel Huddleston,
I knew this was coming.
who suggested to people that they should respectfully call out friends and family for hugging. This is our country, Liam. Mr. Huddleston warned that the Prime Minister may not be able to end restrictions on June the 21st if the public take liberties with Monday's easing of the curb on outdoor gatherings. What's a way of saying off you go without swearing? I mean, I was absolutely astounded by that. And to see the press briefing again with Chris Whitty doing his best to explain why indoor hugging and outdoor hugging were on a par. I mean, these are farcical things. And what I'm seeing, and I suspect you are as well, is a campaign, not an organised campaign, but a very civil disobedience. I mean, we'll hear from some of the listeners later, but people are using their own common sense, Liam. They're seeing their children, they're visiting friends, they're having meals, they're absolutely, not sticking with the roadmap. I reckon the country is about a month ahead of the government in its attitudes. Can we just have a quick bit? Last week we didn't have enough time for a bit of George, which is a highlight for lots of listeners. Can you just tell us quickly who George is, Liam?
Indeed. So George, as we say, whenever we refer to George's data, senior source within NHS England, he or she, we don't reveal George's identity, has full access to the internal data. We don't disclose who he or she is because of their job security, but we're confident of the authenticity of George's statistics, and that's why you report them, Alison, but we can't independently verify them because George gives them to us, by definition, before they're published.
Well, I'm delighted to report, Liam, that George received his or her Planet Normal mug this week.
Oh, fantastic.
And was absolutely thrilled. And I think no one could be more deserving of that hotly contested item. But George says this week that there are still slightly above 3,000 COVID inpatients in English hospitals, 3,115 to be precise. Now, Liam, that's 3,115 beds occupied by COVID patients out of 102,527 available beds.
And am I right in saying, Alison, at the January peak, there are about 40,000 COVID patients in NHS beds? So we're way down.
We've got 3% occupancy now in hospitals. It's tiny. George says the rate of decline has decreased marginally from 25% every week to 23%, but we're now at the same level of bed occupancy as late June last year. You made that comparison earlier, Liam, and that was just before the pubs opened, and we didn't even have a vaccine then. In the last 7 days, an average of 200 patients per day were diagnosed with COVID and 100 admitted with COVID. You'll remember that distinction we draw between those who come into hospital with COVID and those who unfortunately catch COVID while they're in the hospital, although George says even those nosocomial infections are reducing, down from 20% of the inpatient diagnoses to 15%. And this is really interesting, Liam. George says, I think it's unlikely hospitals will be totally clear of COVID by Easter. The lowest number of inpatients we got down to nationally over last summer was still about 450. But with the decline in numbers tumbling, many hospitals should only have a handful of COVID patients. And he or she, George says, all other wider indicators point to the decline in viral infections continuing, so I simply don't see where this third wave, which Boris mentions, is supposed to come from. Hospitals, this is very interesting going forward, in general, are still operating only at around 85% capacity. That's very low, Liam. And George says it's the ambition that the NHS has had for some time to operate at that level. But we can only do that if we're only treating the most urgent and high priority cases, which is what's happening. All the waiting lists are now being prioritised according to clinical risk. The high priority and the longest waiters will go to the front of the queue. But George said it's very much not business as usual for the NHS, and it won't be for some considerable time. And George's final words for us, Liam, are, we need to stop inflicting this economic and psychological damage on our country. So say all of us.
But look, we'll obviously come back to COVID, but I wanted to ask you about something else you penned in your column this week in the Telegraph. And obviously the links to both our columns each week are in the show notes to the episode. You wrote very powerfully about the religious studies teacher at Batley Grammar School in Yorkshire who showed a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad to some of his pupils in a lesson that was explicitly about religious discrimination and how different religions are discriminated against and derided and lampooned. And of course, it's led to an absolute escalation of tensions locally, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's a terrible case, both for this poor teacher, as far as we can tell, a very popular religious studies teacher at Batley Grammar School, who is now in fear of his life, in hiding with his wife and 4 children. This is in the UK, Liam, in 2021. There's that awful aspect. And then there's the absolutely cowardly and useless response of the authorities, not saying teacher unions, which are so vocal, haven't they been about the teachers not being allowed to be at risk by going back to the classroom with children who can barely pass on COVID. So they've been extremely militant about that, but not a peep. They said that they were being supportive of the process that was going on with this teacher, but no word of don't you dare react to teachers like that, to those people who are making veiled threats against him. And we saw the rather marvellously named headmaster Gary Kibble. Sounds like a cat food, acts like a pussy. But Mr. Kibble apologised.
I'm so glad you said that and not me.
I always say that just hoping you're going to make a Mrs. Slocum reference. We know you with your...
I'm free. We were talking about Dad's Army the other day. If we are going back to Are You Being Served, and many Planet Normal listeners will remember Are You Being Served?
Yes.
I think I've always had you down as a young Wendy Richards rather than a mature Molly Sugden, at least for the purposes of the podcast I have anyway. Put my tin hat on. But I would say that of all the male characters, I'm definitely not Mr. Humphreys, John
No.
Inman. I don't think I've quite got the breeding and demeanour to be Captain Peacock, the rather ramrod straight former military floor
How
manager.
about the young Mr. Grace?
I'm probably Mr. Lucas.
You are Mr. Lucas.
I am Mr. Lucas, the sort of sharp, brown-suited geezer who's always trying to get Wendy Richards to go out for a drink.
Yes, you are. You are. Definitely are.
So on that note, Batley Grammar School.
Yeah, just coming back to Mr. Kibble, the headmaster, who really, without any delay, went into full-on appeasement mode of the protesters who were standing outside the school. We can debate, Liam, how many of those protesters were parents and how many they were said to be on Islamist networks, calls for people to turn up and protest. So some of them, I think, were just seeking to leverage this situation to create further community tension. It does seem now that it's possible that 2 further teachers have been suspended. Were they present in the classroom when that lesson was being given? We've learnt from students who've set up a petition, a brilliant petition to have their teacher reinstated, which has now got over 70,000 signatures, that the teacher had warned the students before showing them the images, and he had the intent to educate us, the students said. They don't think he deserves these dreadful repercussions, and nor do they believe he was racist in any way. Now, something, Liam, many years ago I taught in inner city London, and I did teach children from all these different backgrounds, and my observation would be that the kids want to belong. I mean, one of the strongest impulse in a teenager is to be part of the pack, isn't it? Is to have the same phone and the same trainers and to belong. These kids, they want to be British. Most of them want to be British. It is the older generation. It's these imams in their mosques. Some imams,
because many
enough.
do great work, as we both agree. Many have done great work,
yes,
spreading the faith, if you like, on vaccination, encouraging their communities to be vaccinated. But it is some.
It is some, and as far as I know, there are certain type of imams or preachers who come from, say, rural parts of Pakistan or Bangladesh, who are not tremendously happy with the modern Western world. And so these kids are caught, they're in a tug of war match, really, between this very, very traditional patriarchal society and the modern country that they inhabit. And my heart goes out to them because it's very, very difficult to feel caught between 2 worlds. So how marvellous, Liam, that this terrific teacher was teaching a lesson on integration, all right? He was trying to address this really sore spot, which is, it's a real problem in our country with people from certain groups feeling that they don't belong and so on. And this is the difficulty, trying to appease, trying to tamp it down. The cops didn't even arrest any of the protesters outside the school. They dragged off women from the Sarah Everard protest, didn't they? Because they were breaching COVID rules. But I didn't see a single protester outside Batley Grammar School being arrested when they were clearly breaching COVID rules. So I personally feel offended, Liam, that a Batley-born person, this terrific teacher, is having his life and career ruined and is in hiding with his 4 young children for following the school's curriculum, as far as we know, and doing his best to teach his children, the students in his care, about integration and how you can be a religious person and you can be a happy British citizen.
What I'd really like to see, and it's tough during lockdown, of course, but journalists do have certain freedoms to carry on with their work. I'd like to see some really, really good local reporting of what's happening on the ground. I'd like to see interviews with local religious leaders. I'd like to see interviews with local, more moderate Muslim people in Batley and the surrounding area. To what extent do those religious leaders who catch all the headlines speak for the majority of the community? I'd like to see the government saying more about this. Obviously, it's a very, very sensitive area. I think we need to hear from all sides on this, but we can't just allow local thugs, frankly, to take the law into their own hands and create a local law that isn't in line with the law of this nation, backed up by our democracy. And it's interesting that as we've had this situation in Batley, a government commissioned report has come out into race relations across the UK. And again, we've talked about this many times. Remember our fabulous interview with Trevor Phillips, with Sean Bailey as well, the Tory candidate for London Mayor. We're not saying there's no racism in the UK. Of course there is. But you have to get it in to some kind of perspective. And this new government report is very interesting. It's by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. It's 250 pages. I've been wading my way through it earlier this morning. Not everyone will agree with it, but it does say, after a lot of detailed research, that Britain should be regarded as a model for other white majority countries. And that's very much in line with findings from the 2020 Migrant Integration Policy Index. The UK outperforms diverse white majority European countries such as France, Germany, and the Netherlands when it comes to anti-discrimination protections on the grounds of race and ethnicity and religion, by the way. And no one is saying that the UK is perfect. But as I've said in the past, as somebody from an immigrant family myself, whose father, grandfather, relatives suffered real bad racism in this country in the 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, that doesn't mean that individual people in the country now aren't suffering from incidences of racism. They absolutely are. But we've come so far. And unless we recognise progress, the massive progress that we've made over the last few decades, how can we build on that progress?
If you go on telling our society, our young people, you're living in this dreadful racist society when they're not, ultimately they're just going to feel very, very negative about their country. And I think we should be talking up the fact that our country is pretty damn good.
It begins as a love story. Couples who meet as young activists, bonded in a fight against injustice.
We seem to have similar outlooks in life. He often made me feel very special.
It felt like we were in love. I remember it being quite magical.
As far as I was concerned, we had a future together.
I fully did envisage my future with him.
But then, he starts acting strangely.
Suddenly there were secrets and there were inconsistencies and there were things that didn't make sense.
Then one day, he leaves.
I came home from work and I realised immediately that he'd gone.
Vanishes without a trace. And the reason why these men disappear is so disturbing, it's led to a formal apology from the state.
I never for a moment thought that it would be what it actually turned out to be.
This is Bed of Lies, the true story of one of the biggest scandals in recent British history, and the latest podcast from the Telegraph.
Talk about the Stasi in East Germany. That's not how we understand our society.
A tale that travels from the safety of a loving bedroom to the very heart of the law. Search for Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
So, Alison, on to our guest slot. Who's riding in our rocket of right thinking this week?
Well, Liam, we've talked a lot, haven't we, about how children have experienced this lockdown, and we've heard from students. And I thought it'd be really interesting to talk to an actual expert in the field. So I asked Ellen Townsend if she would come and talk to us on Planet Normal. Ellen is the Professor of Psychology at the University of Nottingham. She specialises in self-harm and suicide prevention with a focus on young people. She was a member of the expert review group for the National Coordinating Centre for Mental Health Clinical Competency. And her research has been terrific, and it's influenced guidance and policy for the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Public Health England and the Samaritans. Ellen has spoken out really boldly during the last few months as her concerns about what lockdown's doing to children have deepened. I put it to Ellen that although COVID is, primarily a threat to the elderly, I wondered if she felt that the pandemic had disproportionately affected children.
I think that's the case. And unfortunately, the measures that we've put in place to try to curb the spread of coronavirus absolutely impact on young people and on disadvantaged people in a much more acute way. And we're seeing that in all sorts of ways in terms of loss of jobs, poverty, impacts on mental health, on education and so on. So, not just here, but globally, it's been a real disaster for young people.
The average age of death from COVID is about 82.4 years, which is in line with or even above average life expectancy in the UK. We seem to be the first generation in history not to put the life chances of our young first. What do you think that says about us as a society?
That is something that I have been pondering on for a year. And I cannot understand, even when we have the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, which specifically states that we should put children first in everything that we do. That's Article 3. And that disaster planners say that we should put children first. We should be putting them first now as we recover. We should have put them first as we were going through the crisis. And I always think about the analogy of a sinking ship. I mean, who do we save first? Do we go for the people who have a lot of future yet to live, or do we not? So it's something that's really confused me. And I think what it says about our society is that we're terrible at dealing with death and dying.
Obviously, when we see, very distressing footage from hospitals and so on, that's a very tangible danger or pain or suffering, isn't it? But do you think that there's just a sort of, oh, they're young, they'll bounce back? Do you think there's a bit of that kind of attitude?
I think there's a lot of that kind of attitude, and to some degree it's understandable given that children are resilient and adaptable. However, that requires there being resources for them to negotiate to develop that resilience. It's not done in isolation or, with nothing to support them. And, we know, for example, that calls to domestic abuse helplines increased by 43%. Now, that's all hidden away, and it's not talked about because of the stigma and taboo associated with it. So we've really, not only have we spoiled the life chances of probably all of our young people, for the most vulnerable, we've done the most harm. We've literally neglected them and left them behind. The sad thing is that we've got some really interesting research from social psychology which tells us that if we hold children in mind when we're making decisions, we make more pro-social decisions. We actually make more helpful, more altruistic, kinder decisions, more compassionate decisions. And so with no one being around the table at the cabinet to champion children, it worries me that they just have not been taken into account. And I think the policy making completely reflects that.
You're a scientist, but we have been ruled, or there's an appearance of being ruled by SAGE, those kind of scientists who seem to me, as a mother, to lack these qualities of empathy. Do you think that some of these rules have just been absolutely mind-boggling?
They don't make an awful lot of sense. And the one that I've struggled to understand is the rule of 6, because, it does seem, again, to be very discriminatory towards children. So 6 might be a nice number for a dinner party, but it might be quite tricky to get 2 families with 2 or 3 children together. And a lot of the rule making is arbitrary. It's not evidence-based. It's not assessed in terms of the impact it's going to have. So, children need certainty. They need routine, and they need consistency. It doesn't make any sense to me, both as a mother and as a scientist.
Over the past year, we've had constant adverts and posters, designed to ensure compliance by using fear, I guess. And, we've heard of children saying, I can kill my nana and granddad if I go near them. Do you think it's an issue that the government's messaging has emphasised death over recovery? And what do you think is the likely lasting impact on young minds of this kind of fear?
I think the ethics of inducing fear in that way are morally questionable. And, if I was to, in my research, induce any kind of emotion in the lab, for example, I would ethically expect to make sure that people left that lab feeling as good or better than they did when they came in. Okay, and I'd be checking that. So I'd have an exit plan. And what worries me about what has happened is there doesn't seem to be an exit plan to de-escalate the fear. And my strong feeling is right now, for both children and adults, because I think adults are also terrified, is that we have to reduce the fear narrative now and to increase hope, because children do need to be able to see a future. Young people, adolescents in particular, need to be able to see a future and something that's predictable for them to look forward to, which at the moment, with the constantly moving goalposts, is impossible.
Very sadly, we heard this week from a Planet Normal listener who said that her daughter's best friend had planned to take her own life and had left a note for her parents. Now, that poor girl was 12 years old, Ellen, 12 years old. Unfortunately, tragedy was averted, but I was incredibly shaken by that story and thinking about what that really young girl, a child, had gone through to get to that point. Now, the data from around the world so far suggests that suicide rates haven't risen. Do you still think this is an area for concern?
I absolutely do. And I think one of the things you've drawn out there is the age of people who die by suicide. And of course, there are many reasons that people want to take their own life. There's often a kind of culmination of a number of factors. It's never kind of a simple thing. And it's never inevitable, if things can be put in place to mitigate, to support, then, very different outcomes can be the case. But we saw in July last year a report from the National Mortality Child Database, which showed that in the first 56 days of the initial English lockdown, there was a small but non-significant increase in suicide in young people. Now, the numbers are going to be very small, so detecting a significant difference is going to be quite hard to do anyway, so people are worried about that. Now, the other thing to take into account is that early on in lockdown, we did have a sense of social cohesion, and we know that can be protective for suicide rates. Say they tend to go down in wars, for example, because people feel, we're in this together, we're banding together and so on. And certainly there was, people were checking in on each other, perhaps more than they would usually. Services and supports did respond very quickly. So we've got this interesting picture of, no increase, which is a good thing, but can't be complacent about that. And there are a number of reasons that I say that. Number one, in some countries where there was an initial kind of decrease, we've subsequently seen increases. And we know that suicide rates increase in times of financial crisis. So we saw after the 2008 crash, several years later, suicide rates around the globe increasing. Now, again, none of that's inevitable. If we can put in mitigations to support people and to make sure they get the help they need before they get to crisis, none of that is inevitable. And then the final thing to say about the data that are coming out is that they're preliminary data. So obviously coroners are very careful about verdicts. So the data that we're mostly seeing at the moment is what we call real-time monitoring data. So it's not a coroner's verdict. It's based on police records and so on, which are probable suicide. So we don't have a complete picture yet. So it's something to keep a really close eye on.
Ellen, we should say at this point that, of course, suicide is preventable and there are lots of sources of support for anyone struggling with suicidal thoughts. Samaritans are available to listen to anyone in distress day or night. Ellen, British children have amazingly missed more school than almost any other kids in the world. What do you think the prolonged absence from education means for their generation?
I ultimately think what the evidence would say is reduced life expectancy. I'm afraid it's that harsh. When you look at the data, things like poor mental health or better mental health, better access to education leads to healthier, longer lives. So what we've essentially have done is to, we've stacked a huge burden on our young people. For me, a recovery curriculum needs to address the trauma that young people have been through this year. The burden that they have carried for adults is extraordinary. And we've sent them back to school, and we're testing them, and we're asking them to wear masks again to protect adults. We're putting adults first when we should be putting children first. School needs to be normal as possible. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be regular. We need to have the usual boundaries and rules. They need to know what to expect. It needs to be normal and certain.
The Prime Minister just promised 500 million for mental health support. Do you think there are signs of a children's mental health crisis, and how best would it be? How would that money best be spent?
We came into this in bad shape. So, mental health in adolescence was a problem even before we came into the pandemic. It was on the rise, self-harm was on the rise, and so on. So we came in bad shape with the situation that face-to-face services are not able to cope with the demand, and that is even worse today. So 500 million is obviously very welcome. It's not the billions that are being spent on testing on a daily basis. And again, the kind of parity of esteem between mental and physical health is, I suppose, really laid bare here. And I think we are going to have to think really carefully about how we spend that money. And for me, probably going to need some grassroots organisations to take up the slack and to embed well-being and resilience and mental health within our communities, because I don't think we can rely on the government to do that. I think there's going to have to be a grassroots approach. And really important to have the support in schools, because children spend a lot of time in their school.
I find this is quite a personal thing, really. I find as a mother during this period, everyone's had their strains and their difficulties, but I'm just worried sick about my children, Ellen. There's hardly an hour of the day when I'm not worrying about how they are, what their state is, what their prospects are. And on Planet Normal, we've heard from students, but we've also heard from so many parents who are worried sick about their kids. Can you share with listeners a story that's really concerned you, that's come to your attention?
I think one that really stuck with me was the parent of a 7-year-old child saying that they wanted to go to bed and not wake up, because what was the point in waking up? And I feel the same. I am a scientist, but I am also a mum, and I think that all we can do as parents is to obviously hold our children as close as we can, but listen to them. And I think we really do have to listen to them and try to put them first as much as we can, because the government's not going to do that.
Ellen, you signed the Great Barrington Declaration. We've talked about that before on Planet Normal, which argued that lockdown would cause more harm than good. You're also a member of HEART, the Health Advisory and Recovery Team, which is an alternative group of scientists and medics asking for a more nuanced approach to the pandemic. There has been this real argy-bargy and unpleasantness, hasn't there, between scientists, with some people making the kind of argument you're making, having ad feminem and ad hominem attacks. Has it surprised you that science has become this, rather than finding science isn't one truth, is it? Science is edging forward and collecting all the evidence that you can. Have you been bruised by it?
Yeah, I think many people who have taken a wider view than the dominant narrative have been very bruised, and I have colleagues who they've been harassed, they've been attacked, and their families. It's been with a really negative impact on their mental health, actually, and I suppose I think the vitriol that was thrown at the Great Barrington Declaration was quite shocking, not least because it's really the principles of pandemic planning that was written into the guidance before 2020 happened, and so I think that's what many of us who signed it, with the deepest compassion to protect as many people as possible. And have lockdowns protected vulnerable people? I would like to see proof of that. I have yet to see the proof.
As we go forward, I mean, there's a lot of talk coming out of government about academic catch-up. How would you balance academic catch-up with emotional catch-up? I mean, I don't know your terminology, but do you see what I mean?
It's probably going to come as no surprise to you that I think that the social and emotional aspects need to come first. And if we don't have that mental health and well-being, the learning is just not going to take place. So a focus on, sporting activities, the arts, having fun, just having fun and being together and socialising is going to be a much more beneficial approach. And again, lots of academics working in this sphere have argued for this. Across the age range from little primary school children up to teenagers, and this kind of trauma-informed recovery approach is going to be vital. Unfortunately, I think the testing has already started in earnest, and feel quite disappointed by that, but maybe not surprised. So again, for me, it's got to be a summer of fun for young people. They've got to get out there and have a good time, and that will help them to feel in a good place to achieve academically. No one's going to perform well if you're really struggling with your mental health. It's very difficult.
In the years ahead, Ellen, there's obviously going to be a huge amount of debate about all the measures that were taken to deal with COVID. How do you think we will look back as a society on the way that children were treated?
I think if we don't hang our heads in shame, we've lost it as a society. I think we should hang our heads in shame now that we haven't put children first. We're still not putting children first. I think we're going to be pretty ashamed, is my overall feeling about what we've done and how we've gone about tackling what's happened.
Alison, you know what? I found that interview really actually very moving. A woman of extreme expertise and scientific competence, yes, but a mum. And that really shone through in your discussion with her.
Yes, I think that's something I've found lacking in some of the scientists presiding on the national stage. And I think what Ellen has a tremendous amount of is compassion and insight. As a mother, I thought the fact that she thought people should be ashamed of the way that children have been treated during this period was very, very strong. And I should say, Liam, I know this doesn't shock us anymore, but Ellen has received a lot of abuse, even from scientific colleagues, for the stand that she's taken. And I think they should be ashamed, because I think she's been a marvellous, warm, compassionate and highly knowledgeable voice. And I think her area of expertise, which is young people's mental health, will only go on being more and more important as we come out of lockdown and reveal all the consequences of what it's done to young people. One of our favourite parts of the podcast, listener emails, a selection of the fantastic, insightful, often very funny, sometimes heartbreaking messages you send each week to Liam and me at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We absolutely love hearing from you. We had a lot of response, Liam, to your terrific interview with Hugh Osmond last week.
So he's the guy that set up Punch Taverns, helped set up Pizza Express. He really knows the hospitality sector.
So Louisa says, all hail Hugh Osmond visiting Planet Normal. He hit several nails very firmly on the head. Lack of planning, political panic, dodgy data and poor ventilation. My family call this the Great Pandemonium, and we have remained sane by helping each other. Fortunately, we live in the countryside, so we have chosen which of the appalling regulations are actually relevant, without frightened curtain twitchers grassing us up. We're all healthy, have ignored the news, had the odd cough or cold, plus never tested positive for that cold virus as we've had it. People are breaking out all around us and showing two firm British fingers to the distant bureaucrats. We realise many are still frightened and we respect that, but we urgently need to get out of what has long become house arrest, not quarantine.
This is from Jean-Marc. I'm a huge Planet Normal fan and look forward to your weekly dose of information and sensible comment. Last week, Liam mentioned again how much the media's let us down, kowtowing to the government's agenda without question, baying only for more, faster and harder lockdown and restrictions. This was brought into focus earlier this month when an anti-lockdown march in London was barely reported. I went along and I'd say there were at least 20,000 others there, voicing our frustration and anger at the government's handling of the situation and the continuous fear-mongering that's frightened so many of us into unquestioning compliance. The march filled the whole of Oxford Street as it moved from Hyde Park in central London and was made up of a peaceful and good-natured cross-section of British society in terms of age, background, class and ethnicity. There were a few anti-vaxxers and other fringe elements, but very much the minority. Most of us were just normal people who've had enough, but despite the thousands who attended, media reports were only of a few hundred and focused on the unrepresentative diehards. It was a pleasure to be there with like-minded people. There are many of us, and we are in no way mad or bad. Best wishes, Jean-Marc.
Great, and this is from Damien, not his real name. On last week's podcast, you asked for examples of what we were looking forward to post-lockdown. Odd though it may seem, what I'm most looking forward to is doing a day's paid work. More would be nice, of course. I know, it's great, isn't it? More would be nice, of course, but that first day will be once again to experience the feeling of being valued, of being validated. I work as an independent consultant, and while my industry hasn't been shut down, volume of business has fallen in my sector. Other colleagues are in the same boat, and it helps to stay in touch, but camaraderie can't pay the bills. To be fair, I'm in a far better position than many others who've suffered from economic lockdown, but it still drives me crazy when I hear people say how much money they've saved during lockdown. Of course, I'm also looking forward to returning to meals out, pubs, gigs, etc. But a day's paid work is what I'm dreaming of. Keep it up. Planet Normal hits the spot every week. Well, Damien, I really hope you can get back to work soon.
Good man, and all power to your elbow. This is from Emma telling us the best and worst of her lockdown. Milo's definitely been going through a breakup in December, she says.
Oh.
Breakups are hard to deal with under any circumstances, but just days before Christmas, New Year and ahead of another national lockdown was pretty soul-destroying. Even worse, it was my mum's 60th on Christmas Day. Instead of getting merry, celebrating on board a cruise ship that we'd spent all years saving and planning for, we were at home watching Only Fools and Horses while I cried into my Terry's chocolate orange. I now face life as a singleton in my mid-20s, and with face masks and social distancing in place for the foreseeable, my options for meeting someone consist mainly of online dating profiles, which range from protein shake guzzling, torso flaunting gym addicts to Corbynista liberals. No thanks. One of the glimmers of hope I've been holding on to is April the 12th, when we'll get some of our freedoms back. But the main thing that's got me through lockdown, the person who's provided my best moments, has been my mum. My mum's my rock, my best friend. She's probably stopped me going completely insane. We were very close before lockdown, but our scenic walks, gardening antics, banana bread baking, Netflix binging, mojito drinking and long chats have not only made the whole thing bearable, but actually given me some pretty good times amongst all the bad ones of lockdown. So a big thanks to my mum, and also, of course, to Planet Normal for help getting me through. And a big up to mums everywhere, including my mum and your mum, Alison.
And my mum. And I'm a mum as well, Liam, so well done to me. This next one is, you've got to brace yourself a bit for this. This is a very, very painful email from a listener. We're going to call her Valerie. But Valerie wrote to us, and following the tragic story of the murder of Sarah Everard and the increased talk about sexual harassment and sexual assault, Valerie, who's older, wanted to share her experience because she felt it might be useful for the younger generation of women. So I'm going to read it, Liam, and it is just a warning to listeners. It is very upsetting, but I hope it's worthwhile. Valerie says, I'm sharing my experiences of sexual harassment and assault with you on Planet Normal in the hopes that somehow it will do some good. starting with the worst thing that happened. Around 1983 to 1984, I visited my GP surgery and saw the senior doctor, not my usual GP, with a complaint of pain in one of my breasts. I had to take my 3-year-old daughter with me. The doctor told me to strip to the waist and place my hands behind my back. He then started to slap my breasts, muttering that this was the best way to observe any changes. I was embarrassed, especially as my little daughter could see what he was doing. She was standing behind him and looking puzzled. I tried to reassure her that everything was all right, but I didn't know what else to do. I was so shocked. I've never spoken to her about this since, although she's now 40 years old. I didn't know whether she would remember or understand, and I didn't want to remind her of it if she'd forgotten. However, some months later, I was called for a routine smear test. Arriving at the surgery, I was anxious when it was the same senior doctor, but this time there was a nurse to chaperone me, thank goodness. The doctor performed the test, and then the nurse took away the dish, and then he said, "You can get dressed now." As soon as the nurse left the room, though, the doctor said, "Don't get off the couch, I'll test for fibroids." With that, as far as I'm concerned, he raped me manually. I had had 4 children and I knew plenty about internal examinations. This was not what he was doing. He hurt me and then left me shaking with horror and disbelief. The nurse came back and she looked at me and said, "Are you all right?" I said yes. I was in a state of shock and I could hardly speak. Returning home, I showered and cried. When my husband came home, I told him. He was concerned, but I said there was nothing I could do. No one would believe me. They'd just say it was a medical examination, full stop. I felt dirty. The next day I went to a WI meeting, chatting to some of the women. One of them happened to say that she thought Dr. X was a marvellous man. I did not say a word, but that was when I knew no one would believe me. Over the years, I never mentioned the incident again. The nurse who'd been on duty was my midwife when I had my 5th child. I never said anything to her about what had happened. She was a lovely person, but I just couldn't bring myself to say anything. In time, that senior doctor died. 14 years ago, my husband died suddenly at the age of 60. There were no witnesses left to the awful thing that happened. When some years ago the hashtag #MeToo came to the fore, I felt I needed to tell someone. My youngest daughter and husband were living with me at the time, so I told my daughter everything. I had to name the doctor because she was alarmed that it might be one of the current GPs in our practice. I never became part of the Me Too movement, but now this dreadful murder of Sarah Everard has brought to attention the dangers women live with, even at times when they should be completely safe. The thing about what happened to me is that I wasn't even walking home in the dark. I was in a surgery, lying on a couch, naked from the waist down. Women are vulnerable in many different places. What happened to Sarah was the worst of all. After I told my daughter, I also told my college friend who has a law degree. She said to forget it. She looked up the name of the doctor online. There was nothing said about him other than that he had been a doctor at our surgery. And so my daughter urged me to write to you at Planet Normal in the hope that my experiences of sexual harassment may help somehow with the discussion that must be had if we are to solve these dreadful problems. To finish, can I say that I was extremely happily married for 39 years. I don't hate men. I'm a mother of daughters and sons. Jokes, fun and banter have always been part of our family life. I've known of 2 men who were accused of sexual attacks only for the girls involved to say they made it up. Those men and their families were left ruined by the false accusations. I've even written to my MP about men who've been falsely accused of things. All this proves how difficult it is in these situations to read the truth. I do not know what can be done. There have always been wicked people. Perhaps we could start with teaching good manners and respect for everyone. But how many generations will that take? Well, Liam, I just want to say to Valerie, it's not her real name, but we really appreciate your honesty. And I should say that Valerie's now in her 70s and it's taken a lot of courage to write that. And I do think it helps. I do really feel as a woman who's younger, and I know for my daughters, the sake of my daughters, that women sharing these experiences is extremely, extremely valuable.
What an incredibly important email to end there, Alison, and well done, as you say, to Valerie for writing that down. I'm sure that's helpful to her and to many others. So that's it for another week. From Planet Normal, our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views, Alison and I will be responding as normal to your comments on the Telegraph website, on Thursday morning, the day this podcast is released between 11am and 12 noon. We'll put the link to that article in the show notes to this episode.
I want to pay brief tribute to co-pilot Halligan, who's struggling with a very bad cold and infection this week. That's what comes of sitting outside in the park drinking all those tinnies to celebrate Happy Monday.
It was a bottle of cider.
Do please leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps others to find us, helping the Planet Normal family to grow.
And before we go, Alison, email of the week. Who's going to win one of those limited edition, rare as hen's teeth Planet Normal mugs? It's your call.
Oh, crikey. I think if we appeal to editor Theodora, we might have 2 mugs this week. And I think that Emma, who wrote that lovely email to you about being a singleton during lockdown, and one, of course, to Valerie for her terrific email sharing her experiences from long ago.
So as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers Louisa Wells, Isabel Bourgeard and Elliot Lampitt, and our editor Theodora Laludis. Stay safe and stay in touch with us and with each other. And until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.